And we start the second half of the season, UCF fans, with our look at each and every opponent for 2024 with a trip to Iowa State. And for that, we've brought in Travis Hines of the Des Moines Register, who is a new dad for the third time. Congratulations, first and foremost, Travis. How goes the sleep?
Thank you very much. It's pretty inconsistent, I would say, or non-existent, unfortunately, some nights. But like you said, third time, so nothing new. Just power through and wait for the months to go by quickly.
We weren't going to sleep the next few months anyway, so what's the difference, right?
Exactly, exactly.
We're going to talk a lot about Iowa State today. I want to start with last year before we get into our 5 questions about this year's team. Because last year, UCF fans may not know this, but Iowa State had a quite frankly, huge off-season story develop with a number of gambling-related suspensions. Can you kind of give us the Cliff Notes version of that and how this team was able to rebound and make a bowl game and really become a quality team at the end of last year?
Sure. Yeah. Sports betting has been legal in Iowa for the last few years, but obviously NCAA athletes are not allowed to gamble on NCAA sanctioned events. They're certainly not allowed to gamble on college football, and obviously they're not allowed to gamble on their own games. And Iowa State had a little bit of all of that in a probe that was done by the state investigative agency that has been pretty controversial since its start, and now even after a lot of it's been resolved for the tactics used by the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigation. But I think that's probably not germane to this conversation. But Iowa State lost 5 starters, including its starting quarterback, its starting running back, starting tight end, a starting tackle, and a starting nose guard defensively before the season started. And really, there was questions about it from May right up until mid-August before everything was really clear to everyone about who was not going to be able to play. And I mentioned their starting backfield was unclear going into fall camp for the most part. So Iowa State was in a really difficult position going into the year, and it showed. They started 1-2 with a horrendous loss at Ohio, in which they were physically outclassed by that Ohio team. And it really looked like this was going to be a disastrous season for Iowa State, but they turned it around. I mean, it was really an inflection point when they started 1-2. The offense, kind of found its footing. The defense had been keeping them in it, but they figured it out, got to a bowl game, lost to Memphis in the Liberty Bowl, but all told, given you had so much youth. It wasn't just those 5 starters that they lost. They were playing freshmen on both sides of the ball all over the place. And so for them to get to that bowl game, even in a loss, was a huge accomplishment because of, I mean, it really could have gone sideways for them, where you're looking at a 2 or 3 win season, is what it kind of felt like when we were leaving Athens, Ohio on that Saturday afternoon in September. So for them to turn it around was pretty remarkable. And I think it speaks to a lot of the culture that the coaching staff has, and certainly the competitive integrity that locker room had to be able to pull through. And now you look at what was really a difficult season last year, just in terms of everything swirling around to this year. And there's a lot of optimism because a lot of guys are back from last year's team, a year older, probably a year better. And I think Iowa State fans and Ames are feeling pretty optimistic about the team that they've got going into this fall.
Perfect segue into the rest of this conversation as we get into the first question I have is about Matt Campbell. We've seen him linked to NFL jobs, we've seen him linked to higher profile college jobs, and yet this is year 9 for him in Ames. Why is he really valued staying and offering that program consistency at Iowa State, and what sort of culture has he created in that program?
Yeah, I think all of that is a combination of things. And to start with the culture, they've really stressed, and this is in vogue across the country, but I think they've actually been able to execute it about the process of day in and day out, not getting too high, not getting too low, and stacking days as they come. And it is cliche, but it is something that we've seen them embody for the most part now going into the 9th season under Matt Campbell. And I do think that is the entrenched culture of work ethic, of the famous saying, at least in these parts, was Brees Hall, the now Jets running back after they beat Texas a couple years ago, said it's 5-star culture versus 5-star players. And that's what they've tried to embody. And there were questions about that last year about, do you really have a 5-star culture when you've got guys betting on their own games, breaking the rules about betting in general. And I think you saw how Iowa State responded, that they probably do have a really high level culture. And in terms of Campbell, he inherited a program that was in a really tough space. Paul Rhodes had kind of pulled them up from the doldrums to get to a few bowl games early in his tenure at Iowa State, but the bottom kind of fell out the last 2 or 3 years, and Campbell got them to the best seasons they've ever had in their history, going and winning the 2020 Fiesta Bowl. They made their first conference championship game that year as well, losing to Oklahoma. And that was when his name was the hottest. I mean, that rise up. I think he was mentioned with NFL jobs. He'd be linked to kind of those upper middle tier jobs, like the Tennessees. There was even talk about Florida State when they were kind of getting wobbly. And I think for a long time, Campbell was really picky about what kind of job he would leave Iowa State for. I think he has and had a great situation in Ames in terms of fit, culture, and the ability to run the program the way that he wanted to. And then 2021 happened, where they brought back everybody from that Fiesta Bowl championship team, and they really struggled. They only won 7 games. They lost to Clemson in the Cheez-It Bowl. And then, I think Campbell's star dimmed a little bit. If he wanted to get out, he probably couldn't have to a lateral job. And now you've seen the last year and 2 years really them. Then 2022 was a disaster too. They won 3 games. So like things got dipped pretty quickly. And then you saw the rise back up last year. And again, at Iowa State, the dip was inevitable. I think the 2021 season was certainly hugely disappointing because they had so many guys back. But a lot of those guys were back for their 6th year of COVID. That 2022 was always probably going to be a reset. You don't have 4 and 5 star guys as backups at Iowa State. It's
Right.
developmental. And when you lose so many guys of a top heavy roster, you're due for a setback. And I think we saw that in 2022. And then 23, it was like, okay, like this trajectory is not going back up after those first 3 games. And then you saw it the last 9, of where the culture and the high level of recruiting in terms of what Iowa State has historically done started to show itself. And now it really does appear they're back on that natural, or I guess optimal life cycle at a place like Iowa State, where you build, and then you have a dip. You try to keep that dip shallow and then build back up. And this certainly looks like they're on the build back up portion of things for Matt Campbell.
I want to talk to you about a few of those guys. We'll get to them in just a minute. Just leading off with the running back, Abu Sama III. This is a great league with a lot of, in terms of the running back position. UCF's got a guy in R.J. Harvey that went over 1,400 yards last year. You look at Taj Brooks at Texas Tech. Ollie Gordon at Oklahoma State won the Doak Walker Award last year. But I'm not really sure enough people are talking about what Abu Sama did the second half of last year, particularly against Kansas State. He ran for 276 yards. Had 2 70-plus yard touchdown runs in that game. He averaged 7.1 yards a carry. Are we due for a breakout season for Sama, where we're going to look back and say, why weren't we doing this at the start of the season?
I think it's certainly on the table, and he's got an interesting story too. He's from the Des Moines suburbs, just about 45 minutes from Ames. I think he scored 6 touchdowns in the state championship game for big schools in the state of Iowa, and then really couldn't get on the field early on last season. He was their 3rd string running back for most of the year. And then you mentioned that Kansas State game. This was kind of another bit of adversity and controversy that they had going into the year. Going into that Kansas State game, they basically lost their 1 and 2 running back for the year for reasons that aren't particularly known. I think Campbell had hinted that they were both kind of eyeing the transfer portal to a degree that he did not like, and basically sat them or told them, if you're not all in, we don't need you. So then in that Kansas State game, which, it should take me about 5 hours to drive down there, I think it took 9 because of all that snow.
Right.
And Abu Sama steps in, the 3rd string running back, a true freshman, into inches and inches of snow and wind, and runs for almost 300 yards, goes for 70 yards and a touchdown on his first carry, had another 70-yard touchdown run that game. And the question will be, was that fluky because of the weather? Was it Abu Sama's just showing what he can do? And, he didn't play great. Iowa State as an offense didn't play great in the Liberty Bowl. So I think the jury's still out. But I think Iowa State is really high on him. And when you look at guys like that they've had, even going back to their Toledo days with this staff, with Kareem Hunt, and then Iowa State with David Montgomery, who was with the Lions, and obviously Breece Hall making waves with the Jets, that they know running back. So when they're high on a guy, you listen to them. And I think they are really high on Abu Sama, and certainly what he did against Kansas State would validate that. I think the reason people maybe aren't jumping in full on as Abu Sama as being this, great next college running back is because the sample size is low, and that one eye-popping game was so abnormal in terms of the situation and the circumstances that it does give you a little pause. But certainly he's got the physical tools to be a great running back for Iowa State. It'll just be a matter of can he do it over the course of an entire season, rather than the small burst we saw the last month of the year.
And to supplement that, I think Iowa State's got a pretty potentially, dangerous passing game. You look at what they have. Rocco Beck was the league's freshman of the year. Jaden Higgins and Jalen Knoll went for 1,800 receiving yards, 13 touchdowns. Combined, Ben Bramer is one of the league's top tight ends. So offensively, is this maybe the best total package that Iowa State's had in Campbell's tenure?
It's hard to get them there before the season when you look at that 2020 team where you had Brock Purdy at quarterback, you had Charlie Kohler at tight end, you had Breece Hall at running back, Xavier Hutchinson, who's with the Texans at wide receiver. That I'm not there yet, but you look at the names that you just listed off, it wouldn't shock me if 2 or 3 years we're putting them in that same type of category. It's hard to imagine anybody doing what Brock Purdy's doing in the NFL. But Rocco Beck was the freshman offensive player of the year in the Big 12 last year. So you don't want to take anything off the board. But in terms of their talent, I mean, it is at an extremely high level. Rocco Beck was a revelation for them. He was not supposed to be the starting quarterback last year. It was supposed to be Hunter Deckers, who was the starting quarterback in 2022, but got brought into the gambling probe. And Beck, as a true freshman, had gotten beaten out by a walk-on for the backup job the first 6 or 8 weeks of his freshman season. So that was not a gimme that they were going to be able to have a quarterback of his caliber. And he really showed that he is a high-level Big 12 quarterback over the course of the season. Those two wide receivers are as good as a tandem as it gets. Knoll and Higgins are incredibly good individually, and they complement each other well as a duo, with Knoll being a little smaller, a little quicker, and Higgins having the size to be that downfield threat, to be the guy that can make catches in traffic, that they work very well in tandem. And then you bring Ben Bramer into the equation, and he didn't have a huge year last year, but you watched him physically be able to compete at a Big 12 level at that position, which demands so much, both from a physicality and skill and technical standpoint, that you couldn't help but see an incredible trajectory for him. And talking to people around the program, they have said that he is probably a year ahead of where Charlie Kohler was as a freshman. And Charlie Kohler is probably the best tight end in program history, was a draft pick, and, saw playing time for the Ravens last year. Obviously, that offense can put points on the board there in the NFL as well. So for Bramer to be getting that kind of accolades early on in his career, even if the stats aren't necessarily there, I think you look at that as a sophomore, a year under his belt, he's got the chance to really be a special player for Iowa State.
If Rocco Beck's name sounds familiar to UCF fans and Florida football fans in general, it should, for 2 reasons. Number one, he went to Wiregrass Ranch High School over in the Tampa area. And number two, his father, Anthony, was a longtime NFL tight end for the New York Jets, among other teams. Let's talk about the defense now. 9 starters back there as well. The biggest loss, probably cornerback TJ Tampa, I would imagine, considering he was an NFL draft pick as well. Tell us about the biggest contributors coming back for the Cyclones, and who is going to step up and fill in at cornerback, for that role.
Yeah, I mean, losing Tampa is huge. I mean, he was so good for them, both in coverage and against the run, that he's probably, you're not going to replace him at that level. But what Iowa State does have going for them is, with that 3 safety look that they employ, they've got 3 excellent safeties, and the top of them is Jeremiah Cooper. Bo Freeler and Malik Verdun have all played a ton of football, have all been incredibly productive for Iowa State. Jeremiah Cooper was among the country's leader in interceptions last year, despite missing time and really being hampered by a shoulder injury for much of the year. Those three guys are really going to be able to lock things. The hope for Iowa State, and they've shown it, is to be able to lock things up in the back and allow that front uh, and those corners to maybe feel themselves out a little bit. I think Iowa State has talent in the second or the first and second levels with the defensive line and the linebacking crew, but those guys are still pretty young and are probably going to need a little bit more experience before you can look at them as some of the elite groups that Iowa State has had over the years. But they do have the luxury of those three safeties, really being the linchpin of that defense, and the way that they play that stack defense, it really gives those three safeties a lot of responsibility and a lot of freedom to impact the game in a lot of different ways that they can, maybe overcome some of the youth. And I think there's talented youth up front for Iowa State, but it's still, they struggled to get to the passer last year up front. I think the linebacking crew struggled with athleticism a little bit throughout the year. So that's not a completed group up front. But when you talk about those safeties, I think it gives John Haycock, the Iowa State defensive coordinator, who has really fielded some of the best defenses in the country over the last 8 years, a lot of latitude to figure things out early and kind of roll things up as the season goes along.
Some of those pass rushing woes obviously can be attributed to losing Will McDonald the year before to the NFL draft. He was a first-round pick of the Jets. We just mentioned them twice in this talk. Who would have thought? Last thought. I mean, Iowa State is picked in the top half of the preseason media poll, sixth, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere around there, 6, 7. Yep. Is a league title in reach? Are they in the discussion? Should they be considered in that kind of conversation that they can be a team that gets to Arlington?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't probably put them in the top tier or the favorites, but I think you could put them in tier 2 or put them as a dark horse, because I think they are going to be good. I think they're going to be talented. And I think they have a favorable schedule where they could get to the last few weeks of the year and really have a shot at it. The issue will be is that their schedule is a little backloaded, where they've got at Utah in November and against Kansas State in November. Those are going to be probably the two toughest games on their schedule, with maybe the exception of at Iowa in September. That they're going to have a chance to put themselves in a spot to have a chance, I think, is really what it comes down to. But the big question, I think, from a macro perspective, is Iowa State plays close football games. So that is what they're built for. That's what they want to do. And that gives you the opportunity to win a lot of games, but it also puts games into a lot of coin flip situations where if a call goes against you or a fumble or a mistake that you could otherwise overcome if you were up by 2 touchdowns instead of a field goal, that's the problem that they run into. In the years where they've been good, they win those close games. The years that they've struggled, they lose those close games. And I think there's two line of thinkings: is good teams win those games, bad teams lose them. And then the other line of thinking was a lot of that is chance and luck. And I think that comes into play for Iowa State every year. If they're able to win close games, they're going to win a lot of games. If they get shaky or the ball bounces against them in those close games, then maybe you are looking where a bowl game gets difficult. But I do think the talent and experience and what the coaching staff has shown over 8 years in Ames would suggest that more likely or not, they're going to find themselves in the thick of things going into the last 2 or 3 weeks. And then it's, can you win those, meat grinder games in the meat grinder time of the season?
I haven't gone to one of those games yet, but I feel like Iowa State is like a one of those games that everyone should probably experience once. It's a uniquely, atmospheric, but also not exactly the prettiest football that those teams seem to play every year.
No, they've had some like 44-41 triple overtime games back in the day. But yeah, I mean, as you've seen the Iowa offense devolve and the Iowa State defense get better, yeah, there's been some clunkers, but they're almost singularly entertaining. I mean, they are almost always close. There's usually, I mean, even games that feel out of reach, it's just they're not, because they're usually within a possession or two, because of obviously everybody, I think, who pays attention to college football is aware of what's been going on in Iowa City the last few years with their offense and their defense. And when those two teams meet, and it's always the second week, so neither team is quite fully formed yet. I mean, Campbell had never beaten Iowa until 2022. They beat Iowa. They go 3-0 in September, and then finish the year 1-9 or 1-8 or whatever it was. So like that game can be not necessarily indicative of what's coming, which makes it usually even more entertaining than even if the teams are both good.
Yeah. We've been asking each of the writers to kind of give us a little bit of a prediction. I know it's really early. We're still filming this in July, and the game is not until October. But what's kind of your pulse, your sense of when UCF makes its first trip to Iowa State?
Yeah, I mean, I think Iowa State will be favored, and it'll be, can Iowa State find some separation, or do they find themselves in a close game, which again can be a coin flip. But what Iowa State has been able to do under Campbell is to have a really good home environment. I mean, they're getting 60,000 plus basically every game now, even when they were bad a couple of years ago. It's a really difficult place for teams that are not, this doesn't apply anymore, but the Texas and Oklahomas, or the when Oklahoma State's been really good and come in, unless you are one of those elite national teams, Ames and Jack Trice Stadium usually means you're in for a slugfest. And I would imagine UCF will find that to be the case when they come up to Ames this fall.
And I'm not sure exactly how that's going to suit them. I think, I mean, they're kind of built for, you imagine they're built for kind of games like that, with the way that they've, built the running game with KJ Jefferson, with RJ Harvey, Penny Boone, and the like. I mean, they were fourth in the country in running the football last year. Typically that travels. But I do think from an atmospheric standpoint, from a difficulty on the road, other than Florida, this is to me the hardest game on the schedule for the road perspective. And I kind of lean Iowa State as well. Travis, where can people find your work, and where can they find you on social media?
Des Moines Register.com and Travis Hines 21 on Twitter. Those would be the two main places to check it out.
And then for Iowa State fans watching this, for UCF fans, I'm at Chris Boyle DBNJ, and you can find all of our preview content on news-journalonline.com. Travis, thanks so much for taking time today.
Thanks for having me.